but I want to get a little background on high tide flooding because not everybody fully understands what that means. So can you tell me the difference between high tide flooding and other types of flooding?
Well, high tide flooding is really the result of decades worth of sea level rise. It happens now for many reasons. It could be a full moon tide, it could be a change in the prevailing winds, it could be a storm surge. But more times than not, it's sunny outside, there's water in the streets, and people are scratching their heads asking what is going on.
Yeah, for sure. I used to be a broadcast meteorologist in Charleston, South Carolina, and trying to explain to people why it was sunny and the streets were covered in water was always interesting. So you mentioned the moon and the phases. Can you explain scientifically where that comes from, how the moon and our tides are interacting?
Sure. Well, the moon is really the driver of the tides. For the most part, the sun is involved too. When you have a full moon or new moon, when it's big and bright or you can't see it, the tides are just higher. It's just the way that the geometry works. And then there are certain times of the year in the fall when the water is warm, it's accumulated a lot of heat. September or October, those full moon or new moon tides hit. Sea levels are already about a foot higher because of just this natural annual cycle in sea levels themselves. And those are the times when Charleston floods, when Annapolis floods, when Norfolk floods. That usually is in the fall. It's an East Coast signature, it's a Gulf Coast signature. Again, it's decades worth of sea level rise coupled with now a garden variety of reasons why communities are flooding. And when it rains, it's just that much more impactful.
Yeah, you mentioned a few cities there. So those are at risk. Are there any other spots in the US that are really vulnerable to this?
It really is almost every coastal community in the East and Gulf Coast right now. The West Coast is catching up. Sea levels have not been rising nearly as quickly. Water doesn't move up and down like it does in the East and Gulf Coast and the West Coast has a very deep, narrow continental shelf. Water just doesn't pile up like it does when you have a very shallow, wide continental shelf. So New York, Boston, Atlantic City, Annapolis, Norfolk, Beaufort, North Carolina, you just really start picking all of your coastal communities. It's either water coming up through the storm drains, but a lot of these communities now it's spilling out onto the streets. It's flooding people's properties, flooding businesses. It's slowing commutes. It's slowing commerce. It's weighing on people's patience.
Okay, so this report came out kind of going over the past year. Why has the past year seen more high tide flooding? I know you mentioned sea level rise, but that's kind of a long-term issue. So in the short term, what's been causing it?
Well, last year we had a few record breakers. We had it was a La Nina, so there's climate patterns too that are at play on top of sea level rise. Last year we had a couple tropical storms, hurricanes that brushed or made direct landfall. That counts too. That's causing flooding. And that was really sort of the driver of a few of the record breakers in the Caribbean and southern Florida. Uh, but looking towards next year, we're moving into a phase of El Nino. Now, El Nino changes things. El Ninos tend to cause higher sea levels on the West Coast, higher sea levels on the East Coast, and more storms that are oriented towards the mid-Atlantic region of the East Coast. And so what we're expecting is even more risk, more chance of high tide flooding, let's say, as compared to last year or the year before.
Okay, so how do you measure and forecast these? Let's start with the measurement.
So it all stems from our tide gauge network. These tide gauges have been on the ground for over 100 years in many locations. They're there to make sure we have safe shipping, high tide, low tide. From the very beginning of this country, it was really based upon maritime commerce. And believe it or not, it still is. And these sentinels at the sea are there for many purposes, but they're also capturing the creep of sea level. And when we pair this with knowledge on the ground, working with local emergency response managers and the National Weather Service, through years of impact monitoring, they know when water gets so high, as measured by a tide gauge, a ruler, if you will, when water hits 3 feet or 4 feet, types of impacts will happen. Water in the streets, water coming out of the stormwater system, and they have 3 severity levels. And what we're talking about now is more of the minor flooding, nuisance flooding. It's mostly disruptive, not downright damaging. But when the water levels hit these heights, we measure it, we report it, and we now anticipate it and predict it. There's such a strong trend due to sea level rise that we have a pretty good understanding that the past is going to repeat itself, but unfortunately, it's moving upwards, and we just characterize this future based upon the past. And El Nino, La Nina, some other major climate drivers, as we know they're going to unfold. We are able now to make predictions so communities know what to prepare for and budget and be ready.
I know the Weather Service is coming out with some new flood mapping techniques. Is that something that will be integrated into coastal flooding as well, or is that more river flooding?
They are focused largely on river flooding, but we definitely, with the infrastructure bill that was passed a few years ago, there is definitely an emphasis to make sure folks better understand flood risk in general, whether it's riverine flooding or coastal flooding. We need folks to be prepared, whether it's, watch out, something's coming 2, 3, 4 days ahead of time, be prepared. Now we're really starting to try to give better emphasis on what to expect next month, next season, and next year. So again, the mobilization costs are going up as folks need to respond to impacts as they start to pile up in these communities. You know, Eventually the long-term fixes with sea level rise. I know it's a conversation in places like Miami and Charleston and Norfolk. These are real, the telltales of what's coming along a lot of the other coasts. They're really trying to get ahead of it and tackle this problem. But until long-term solutions are put in place, there's going to be a real need for guidance on sort of the monthly, seasonal, annual basis to complement the weather forecasting 2 to 4 day outlooks that we already provide.
Yeah, those cities you named, it was a lot of familiar cities with the Dutch dialogues. Have you seen, I need some good news here. Have you seen some progress made in infrastructure and changes in cities that are changing to become more flood resistant?
Absolutely. I think the first step is identifying the problem and realizing why that problem is growing worse. And much of it is sea level rise. And so, in conversation with, let's say, the Dutch dialogues, a country that's right at the edge, a lot of it's below sea level. How do you live with higher water? I think communities are really starting to sort of look internally and holistically at what's important to them. What ports, what streets, what areas need to stay viable. Where might they allow water to infiltrate within these communities and live with it, and plan green or gray infrastructure as needed to provide that protection. Pumps. There's a variety of responses. For the most part, the solutions are found and funded locally. And so I think it's really important as these communities really take the lead, and unfortunately having to take the lead in being prepared, share and work together so that other communities can learn and live accordingly and maintain a viable coastline, because it's so strategically important to us as national security, but commerce driven society that we live in. NOAA and our federal partners recognize the importance of the problem of the magnitude of which these communities are facing. So we're hand in hand, lockstep with these communities and make sure that they have the data, the models, the information to make the smart decisions. So we're here in the long haul with you.
Hey, thank you so much for watching. While you're here, check out some other videos you just may like.